My name is Sally Kempton. I'm a spiritual teacher in what I call a contemplative devotional tantric tradition, based on the kind of Hindu non-dual understanding that's most clearly expressed in non-dual Kashmir Shaivism. I was for many years a student of Swami Muktananda, so my tradition is it's very much Kundalini driven, devotional. You know, I teach in that interface between the devotional and the non-dual, which is, I think, really the gift of the Hindu traditions. You know, is this ability to combine love and wisdom in a sort of heart-based yet non-dual style, and I do my best to transmit that. I'm also a writer. I've written a couple of books called Meditation for the Love of It and Awakening Shakti, the Transformative Power of the Goddesses of Yoga, meaning the Hindu goddesses. I've just released a CD called Doorways to the Infinite, which is it's really a commentary and a series of meditations on a very profound Kashmir Shaiva text called the Vijnana Bhairava, which you probably know, which literally means the experiential wisdom of the divine. And it's a series of 112 meditation practices that are actually foundational practices in both Hindu and Buddhist tantric texts. So that's a 6 CD course for Sounds True, and that's kind of what was talking about at the conference, was one of the practices from that text. I try to adapt these ancient practices to contemporary understanding and make them user-friendly. And so that's what I do. I'm kind of unaffiliated at this point. Really very interested in the interface of devotion and non-dual wisdom and psychology. I've pretty much always been devotional. In my early years, I was kind of a love addict. that what moved me always was the opening of the heart in situations that kindled my heart. I grew up in a left-wing humanist, not very love-saturated family. So the search, my spiritual search, my first awakening actually was a kind of download of, cosmic love that just kind of came into me from all sides. And that recognition, which came with a kind of certainty that love is the essence of everything, just changed my whole life. I was a feminist journalist, downtown Manhattan journalist, and very deeply political and cynical, and that glimpse, that darshan, just reoriented my priorities. So I started meditating because that was the only thing I could think of to do, and one thing led to another, and I ended up becoming a student of Swami Muktananda, and somewhere in the midst of that I had a kind of classic Kundalini awakening. So for me, in my early days of practice, there always seemed to be a tremendous dichotomy between the heart-based practice, which is essentially mantra, and my love for my teacher, who was a very who among his other capacities had this power to create a love field around himself that was utterly magical and beautiful, and which I was extremely drawn to. So there was that, and then there was my non-dual self-inquiry practice, which, and I would find that the self-inquiry practice would kind of instantly put me into what at that time I felt was an awake state. I'm a very equanimous witness, open, emotionally free state of real genuine equanimity, but without the juiciness of love, of the heart. Whereas my mantra practice, my devotional practice, would open my heart, open me to love, and also bring up a tremendous amount of emotional purification, so that I would be crying and I would be, kind of getting nuts the way you do when there's a lot of emotion coming up. And I spent years, trying to understand which is my path. Is it the heart path, which is so juicy, but so emotionally labile, or is it that inquiry path, which is so clear and so free, and yet doesn't have that juice? So really, a lot of the integration in my personal practice was of the gradual coming together of the two. And that pretty much I teach inquiry, but from a heart-centered experience, and because for me that was the big integration and breakthrough in my personal practice. It's what I try to help my students and the people I work with kind of bring forth in themselves. Neither this nor that, but both. At the moment, at this particular point, I am actually doing a kind of a formal goddess-oriented tantric worship mantra practice, which is not something I've done in the past. My basic practice is meditation, and my basic meditation practice is to employ a technique which can be mantra or can be just focus on the breath until the meditation current opens up, and then I just rest in what arises. So it's a very it's a kind of a non-practice practice. In other words, I sit and I work with whatever arises, or I don't work with it. I just let myself be present with it. The formal devotional practice I've really actually been doing for about a year, and it's been it just kind of came to me because I had 4 or 5 years ago I was, if you forgive the word, guided to begin teaching about the goddesses of the Hindu tradition, the goddesses like Lakshmi and Durga and Kali, and I discovered that for me and also for the people who were studying with me, the working with the goddess archetypes brought up an enormous amount of insight into the feminine, as the feminine presents itself in our humanness, and also brought up a huge amount of Shakti, of really powerful energy that manifested for people in different ways, but which was so palpable and so strong that it felt to me as though these were teachings, these were forms of wisdom that really wanted to be in the world at this time, and that I had been presented with, with the opportunity to be a voice for these goddesses. So I was teaching about the goddesses and meditating with them, and wrote a book called Awakening Shakti, which was mythology and kind of psychological understanding of how these wisdom goddesses show up in the world, and how they show up in personality, and how you can invoke them. And it was quite an exquisite experience writing, and it took about a year. And then when the book was just about to be published, when the book had just come out, I suddenly realized that in all this time, I had never been to a goddess temple. I had never done a formal goddess puja, worship. And I thought, oh my God, what is this? I have not done formal tantric goddess practice at all. It was purely kind of a channeling, a connection to the subtle forms of these energies. And I thought, okay, I should do a formal practice. It's the least I can do under the circumstances. So I took a kind of a casual initiation from a friend of mine who is a long-time tantric practitioner into this particular formal ceremony, and I began to do it fairly casually in a fairly succinct form, because I'm not so much about that kind of ritual formal practice. And it turned out to be utterly ecstatic and revelatory, and totally kindled my sort of deep aspects of my interior energies that felt like they'd been dormant or needed to be awakened in a deeper way. So I've been doing a classical devotional practice for the last year, and part of what the interesting thing about devotional practice is that you can do it on several levels. You can do a very dualistic, I'm here and the deity or the person is there. But in tantric practice, as you probably know, you always begin the practice by installing the deity in yourself, since the basic tantric approach to deity practice is worship Shiva by becoming Shiva, worship Lakshmi by becoming Lakshmi. So there's a whole practice for literally installing the deity energy in your body through the use of seed mantras. So the effort is always to just kind of bring forth what's deeply hidden underneath the mind, or easily available underneath the mind. But I've never, except in my relationship with my teacher, ever looked for the divine in an individual or a form or a statue or a painting or a symbol. But what this practice has done is really invested these symbols with a kind of profound magic. So it's kind of broadened my sense of what practice is in ways that I don't think I've fully realized. I'm just kind of enjoying it. There's one of the translations of the Sanskrit word bhakti, which is the Sanskrit word for devotion. That the root comes from a word that means relishing or enjoying, and it's a very, very enjoyable practice. I'm really, really, really liking it. So I don't know what the ultimate effect is, but it's interesting to be doing devotional practice 40 years into my sadhana, really not for the sake of achieving anything or attaining anything or really even opening anything, but kind of for the sake of love, and finding that it yields such profound delight just in and of itself. And that, I think, is the gift of devotional practice. It really gives a lot of delight. Well, to begin with, I just had to put all that aside. I've never been part of the feminine spirituality world at all, so I kind of came into this rather innocently. And in fact, my teacher, although he himself was a tremendous devotee of the goddess, he was a devotee of the goddess as Kundalini. Is really the goddess as the inner as the manifestation of the inner transformative energy within the human being. So I was never part of a tradition that taught this, and I really came to it without any beliefs at all. Really more, I had a kind of a visceral recognition, and I actually talk about it. It's the first story in my book. I'd been invited to participate in a goddess ceremony in India one year, and I was telling stories about the goddesses and enjoying that because I like telling stories. But I found that as I invoked them, that something was happening inside me and around me that literally shifted the way I saw the world. And intellectually, I understand that what had happened was that the Shakti aspect of the divine had just come alive in my vision, so that I was beginning to be able to see literally the pulsing divine energy, and it was very much a vision of divine energy, just kind of in nature and in the trees and in my body and in other people. And it was very clearly the result of this connection that had been forged during that event. by invoking specific forms of the Hindu goddesses, you know, specifically the goddess Durga, especially the goddess Lakshmi and the goddess Saraswati, and without ever getting into the, you know, the ideas about goddesses and the I am a goddess thing that, you know, that people in California do. It just kind of arose spontaneously. Really, it felt like a gift, much more from inside. And at a certain point, I was teaching a retreat. This was in 2005, and trying to decide what I was going to teach that day. And just a recognition came to me that sounds very simple, that you know, because we all understand that Shakti, you know, the energy aspect of consciousness, is being non-dual. You know, it's present in what feels divine and also what feels undivine. And I had this recognition that these personifications of Shakti were functioning in the world at many, many different levels of consciousness, because they are inside us. You know, they're operating through the mind, they're operating in shadowy forms. You know, when, for instance, it's kind of obvious when Lakshmi is not understood, you know, she operates as our addiction to consumerism, and as our, you know, as our obsession with money, and as our poverty consciousness, and you know, and as the belief that to be a, you know, that to be a successful woman you have to be gorgeous and your body has to look a certain way. That's all shadow Lakshmi, Lakshmi being the goddess of beauty and abundance, you know, wealth and good fortune. And in the same way, I started to see, okay, so Durga, that particular form of feminine energy, you know, which is in its pure form absolute protective strength, you know, the capacity to push through obstacles in an utterly graceful way. In its shadowy form, you know, it's Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada, you know. So that, and I started to see the way these archetypes, you know, actually can be seen. Their footprints are everywhere. So it was just a way of really giving, let's call it a personal face to non-duality for me. And so I never got into the, you know, the California goddess thing. And so it never was an issue. It never was a problem. I never felt that, in fact, in the last year, I've started to listen to some of the work that other teachers do with the divine feminine, and, you know, it's great. And it's not that I have insights that other people don't have. Obviously, you know, we're all dipping into the same insight pool. But I kind of came to it from a different perspective. No. I mean, I'm really about both and. You know, I really do experience very deeply that the personal and the impersonal are just two faces, just two sides of the coin. So, and my teacher, so, you know, in a certain sense, this is my tradition, that my teacher, like many Indian non-dual teachers, enlightened teachers, he came out of a religious Hindu background. He was a Swami. He came from South India. He was brought up by a religious mother who taught him the mantra Om Namah Shivaya when he was 5. And he was a Shiva Bhakta. He was in love with Shiva and very much into worship and you know, formal ritual. And then he met his guru, who was an absolute non-dual realized, you know, being who you may have heard of, named Nityananda, yeah, who you know, who's utterly about, you know, no form, almost no language. And he said, forget all this external worship stuff, just worship Shiva inside. So, you know, the mantra is Shivoham, I am Shiva, I am that. And as Muktananda became, you know, as his practice cooked and became more and more non-dual, it incorporated this very, very easy, you know, sense of personal relationship with with deity in form and without form. It was never an issue for him. And he, in fact, shortly before he passed away, he was being interviewed by a reporter in Kashmir who said, "What is your greatest accomplishment?" And this was at a time when, you know, he'd been one of the early Indian teachers to come to the West. He had thousands of students. He'd written books. He'd accomplished a lot, and he was enlightened. He said, "My greatest accomplishment is that I've made friends with Shiva, you know, that I've made friends with God." And so, to me, you know, actually being Western, having been brought up in not exactly an atheist family, but a family in which religion and spirit were just not even interesting. I didn't have the baggage of, you know, of tradition as a lot of people who were brought up in religious traditions had. So I didn't, you know, I didn't believe in God. I mean, God was not even a, you know, God was not of interest to me, you know, except insofar as, you know, I was kind of interested in comparative religion. So to actually experience a personal darshan of deity really was revelatory. I mean, it was very, very transformative. It was not such a big deal to experience, you know, spacious consciousness or even the opening of the heart, but to actually say a mantra or chant to Krishna, which was my actual first experience of this, and have this very, very personal, real, energetic experience of something that was both inside me and completely other, was, you know, it was kind of a fruition of practice at a certain point. I think I'd been doing serious practice for almost 15 years when this started to happen, perhaps from past life longings, I don't know. But so it wasn't like I made a transition. To use Ken Wilber's language, the idea that the divine is everywhere, is, you know, is within all, is inside me, and is also a actual personal, you know, person. It was, I wouldn't say it was a no-brainer because it took me a while to recognize what was happening, but it was just so kind of natural. It's not, they don't they don't cancel each other out. Well, first of all, the practices in the Vijnana Bhairava are really foundational practices. In other words, if you read the text and you practice these things, you realize that, you know, your Zen teacher taught them. A lot of these practices are part of Tibetan Buddhist retreat practice. Reggie Ray in his CD sets on Sounds True, which I recently listened to, is using practices that I don't think he got from the Vijnana Bhairava, but they've been part of the trans-Himalayan traditions for a long time. And, you know, interestingly enough, scholars now recognize that what is called Tibetan Buddhism, you know, the Vajrayana tantric tradition of Buddhism, actually originated with Shaivite teachers in the Himalayan region, because all those guys lived in the same place. So apparently Kashmir Shaivism and that particular tantric tradition, which is really very, very deeply integral. You know, in other words, the Vijnana Bhairava, well, let me tell you the story part of it. So the Vijnana Bhairava is a tantra from a Shaiva tradition, and the form of these tantric texts is a dialogue between Shiva and Shakti. So it's, you kind of imagine these two deities, they've just made love, they're in their Himalayan castle, they're you know, their woodland. In the tradition, it actually becomes a palace, even though they were yogis living in the forest. And she says to him, so tell me, what's the path that takes you to the ultimate truth? And, you know, and she says, is it, and she then begins to list all these complex tantric practices. Does it have to do with putting the letters on different parts of your body? Is it, you know, is it moving up the 6 paths from the body up to the non-dual? she lists all these practices, and he says, no, all these practices are basically bullshit. They're all, stories that are made up to take people with worldly minds into a more pacified condition. The real truth is without form, it's without name, it's the bliss that arises when the ego has completely dissolved and you enter into the absolute spaciousness of consciousness. And then he says, but this cannot be known. It cannot be seen. So the path to that is through Shakti, is through the energy aspect of consciousness. And then he proceeds to give her a whole series of practices, and the first one is that, that great practice of following the breath and finding the space between breaths. So, and it's one of the fundamental teachings is the space between, which is, such a powerful part of so many meditation traditions. You find the space between the breaths, you find the space between one thought and another. And then he goes on to give a practice for drawing Kundalini Shakti up from the heart to the topmost center. And then he does, there are literally 115 practices, including meditate on the void between the armpits, meditate on the bliss at the heart of enjoyment, of food, of music, of sex. It's, the great tantric sexual practice is one of the techniques in the Vijnana Bhairava. And some of them are, realize that your consciousness pervades everywhere, or realize that your mind doesn't exist. So there are very many levels. It's the whole thing about tantric practice is that you start where you are. So if you're very body identified, you would do something that involved the breath and the body. If you're more unity oriented, you can just say, my body is void, and just enter spaciousness and emptiness, or say, wherever my mind goes is Shiva, which is one of my favorite practices from that text. So the one I did today, and one I found, it's really a core tantric practice that's unbelievably useful for contemporary practitioners, is to really allow yourself to fully experience an emotion like fear, anger, love, and instead of trying to escape from it or enter equanimity, you go straight into the emotion itself until you really have entered into the heart of the feeling, and until it resolves and really reveals the spaciousness of the absolute Shakti that's at the heart of everything. So they're very, very non-dual practices, but they understand that this teaching understands that you walk through the door that's available to you and at any given moment, because any one of these doors is going to lead you into the ultimate. So that text, the Vijnana Bhairava, even though the language is archaic, the experience is completely eternal and very, very modern. Tantra is a very, very modern tradition, and one of the things I've always remembered from a writer, Edith Hamilton, who wrote about Greek culture and Roman culture. She wrote a book called The Greek Way and the Roman Way that talked about very, very brilliantly about the culture of the classical era. And she said there are certain writers, and she cited Euripides and the prophet Isaiah, who always seem modern. And it's if you know those. If you know Euripides and if you know the book of Isaiah in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you realize that it's absolutely true. They're speaking to us, as though they were, despite the archaic language, as though they're addressing issues of human concern that are both timeless and totally up to date. And the Vijnana Bhairava is one of those texts. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's it's probably says something about our sexual obsession in, in the late 20th and early 21st century. It's also true to be full disclosure that there is quite a lot of sexual practice going on in tantric sects in India. So it's not as though it's something that we just made up in the West. And something that Georg Feuerstein said that I thought was really interesting, Tantra is known, especially hardcore left-handed Tantra, is known for giving you sadhanas that, in which you drink wine, you eat meat, you eat fish, you do so-called, you become intimate with so-called impure substances, including sexual fluids and blood. And one of the things that Georg said that I thought was quite relevant is that in India, because there's such an emphasis on physical purity, these practices could kind of shock you out of your belief system. Whereas in the West, we don't have those issues. So they don't have, those practices don't have the profound impact on our, on our belief systems that they do in India. So they're perhaps not so relevant, as some of the subtler practices of Tantra. So yeah, I think that Tantra in the West has become kind of a synonym for couples, kind of couples sex therapy, and it's if it improves your relationship, why not? But it isn't the depth of Tantra.